background on my own work, I guess, and the work of the Waterloo Climate Institute to sort of set the context. It is perhaps, I don't think it's ironic, perhaps characteristic of our time together this week that we start off with a talk by a non-mathematician. Very much not that person, but I have a very interdisciplinary background, both in science and social science. And that's kind of the lens through which I approach the complex issue of climate change. So for the last 2 years, I've been the executive director of the Waterloo Climate Institute, which is one of the university level centers and institutes here at the University of Waterloo. And what that means is that rather than being tightly tied to just one faculty, we draw in professors, researchers, more than 130 of them from all 6 faculties across campus if they do climate work. So they might be historians, they might be political scientists, they might be engineers, mathematicians, you name it. If they work on climate change, hopefully they come through us. And so it's our goal to be this hub for inter and transdisciplinary climate change scholarship, to find those connections amongst ourselves, to ask big questions, to come up with innovative solutions, and to kind of mobilize our work together so that it has the greatest possible impact on policy and practice in the private sector. So that's the work that I do with the Climate Institute with an excellent team. Jose DeBella is part of our team sitting in the front here. And we work closely with WICI and other institutes across campus to do that work. For the last 5 years, I've been one of the lead authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that is the UN led body of scientists that come from every member nation of the United Nations, right? The national governments of all of those member nations nominate scientists to come together, also from all different disciplines, to assess the state of climate science and social science. The goal of the IPCC isn't to do new science, technically. The goal is to assess all of the excellent science that has taken place around the globe over a sort of chunk of time, and then feed that synthesis into the political process of deciding what to do about it. So we have the Paris Agreement and international treaties and such, Kyoto before that, and the IPCC feeds the science into that process so we make better decisions. I will, despite what Johanna said, talk about some of the key findings of this latest 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so that we're all on the same page with that. I'm not going to do an introduction to climate change, except for like 1 or 2 slides. I'm sure we're all sort of familiar with the fundamentals, but that will be my plan today. Oh, one other bit to mention is that for the last 2 years, I've been working really closely with NRCan and Environment and Climate Change Canada on Canada's first national adaptation strategy. So just over the last couple of months, it's actually still in draft form, we have our first nationwide adaptation strategy, and then also an action plan for the federal government. So that's been a really interesting process. I've been co-chairing one of the expert advisory tables on a strong and resilient economy. There are also advisory tables on infrastructure and health and the natural environment and such. So I kind of straddle these worlds of mitigation, the greenhouse gas reduction side of climate change, and adaptation, the kind of protecting communities and responding to impacts world. So I'm always on thin ice and I always feel out of my depth. And that's my strength, I guess. There's comfort with that. So today in our time together, I'm going to start off by sort of setting the stage, what I would call the transformation imperative, the climate change imperative. Where are we and why is this so urgent? What kind of approaches have scholars, practitioners developed to conceptualize the scale of change that we find ourselves navigating? And then talk about the ways that natural and human systems in particular are connected, the multitude of sort of interconnections in those complex systems, ways to think those through. Then we're going to stop, we're going to break up, and you're going to have to do some of that same thinking in small groups, and we'll talk about it as a whole as well. And then we'll move into territory that's sort of my home turf. I consider myself, roughly speaking, a climate change governance and policy scholar. And I focus a lot on the governance of sustainability transitions and transformations. So that's kind of where I'm most at home. So I'll move into some ways of thinking about how to steer change in these complex systems, or how to maybe influence or manage change before we wrap up. So that's the plan. Okay. Checking my time. Okay. Is this figure familiar to anyone at all? I wonder if I can make that top thing disappear. Nope, can't. Okay, does anyone recognize this? Yeah. Okay, do you know what it's called?
Safe operating space or planetary boundaries.
Planetary boundaries, yes, exactly, right. So one effort to grapple with and define a safe operating space. So how can humanity survive, operate, function without pushing systems, Earth planetary scale systems, over thresholds from which we sort of cannot return. So this is an effort by Johan Rockström and others to identify those planetary scale systems, and with access to quantitative data, actually indicate where thresholds in those systems might be. And part of the power of this framing is to sort of delineate that set of systems, explore the connections among them, and then think through what that tipping point might look like that would create cascading change sort of throughout at planetary or continental scale systems. So the planetary boundaries that were identified by Johan Rockström and others, you'll see here, they're a little bit odd to navigate, but here we have climate or land system change. We have novel entities, which is a strange phrase for like nanomaterials and radioactive materials. So like new things moving through the environment. That's novel entities. Biogeochemical flows like phosphorus and nitrogen, so fertilizer and other nutrients moving through ecosystems. Ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol loading, stratospheric ozone depletion, freshwater change, climate change, and biosphere integrity, like biodiversity, essentially. So those are these planetary scale systems that the planetary boundaries folks have identified. And crossing those thresholds, they say, triggers nonlinear, abrupt change with continental to planetary scale repercussions. So these aren't isolated slices of nature. The connections are many and complex. A 2022 update of this very famous framework indicates that 6 of those planetary boundaries have been crossed already. Biogeochemical flows, novel entities, climate change, biosphere integrity, and land system change. That was 5, and water, that's 6. One of those boundaries in particular is the one that concerns us most for this week, which is climate change. And it's considered one of the core boundaries in that it kind of affects all of the others. It's stability in that area is central to stability in the other planetary boundaries. I would just pause here though and say that as a social scientist, I look at this figure and I ask, where are the people? Where are the politics? Where are the economies? Where is the culture? Where is the technology? Kind of that even is sort of obscured by these physical systems that are being identified here. There are other efforts to do that, and we'll get there. But let's just focus on the scale of change in the climatic system to start. Nope, wrong. So this is perhaps a very familiar figure to all of you, but this shows concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You can go and check the current parts per million, the current concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere anytime you want at the Scripps Institute. I took a reading back in January, but just last week it was quite a bit higher even than January. But this is a combination of observational data taken at Mauna Loa, Hawaii, so actual atmospheric sampling to indicate how high the concentrations of CO2 are, and then ice core sampling back 800,000 years to show the concentrations of CO2. So a combination of different methods to ascertain the concentration of CO2, and this is where we are today. So unprecedentedly high concentrations of CO2 and rapidly escalating levels of CO2, even over the last 100,000 years. The first little chunk here, whoa, yeah, anyway, the last 10,000 years is a particularly important time to just be mindful of, because that is, you know, sort of the bulk of like recorded human history, civilization, et cetera. The hundreds of thousands of years before then were very different. But you can see just how extreme this change, of course, is. It's unprecedented, leading to this. So this is a visualization of average temperatures. Each little spike is a country around the world. They're not geographically accurate. They're just sort of arranged in a global form there. With the blue being cooler than average, the orange and red being warmer than average, and we sort of get this sense of a pot bubbling over over the last couple of decades. So we're seeing the clear link between, or the clear repercussions of increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere with temperatures going up. So those first order impacts of the global energy imbalance caused by the emissions of greenhouse gases, leading to increasing temperature, shifting precipitation patterns, and sea level rise. Those, you know, most important constellation of first order impacts rippling out throughout human and natural systems, with impacts on our forests, impacts on our coastal areas, agriculture, water resources, biodiversity, species, and health, of course. Missing from this figure, we might talk more about the conflict over resources, food, water, et cetera, that we are seeing unfold even now, but more so into the future. Extreme events are kind of embedded here, but not explicit. Heat waves, for instance. So we're seeing this kind of cascade of effects from those first order impacts of temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise to second order and third order impacts as they progress. A really helpful context within which to think about those connections is in the context of health. Health was one of the major chunks of the National Adaptation Strategy. Of course, it's very central to Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But we see again those first order impacts in the center, rippling out to changes in extreme heat, environmental degradation, food and water, and those food and water, for instance, then leading to malnutrition, the spread of disease, et cetera. So we see this cascading series of climate change effects. Health, as it turns out, has been a very powerful way to frame and talk about climate change. It brings in a whole new set of disciplines and a really important sort of mode of communication around who is most affected. We know that the impacts of climate change are not equally distributed, of course, around across the country and across the globe. And so especially in light of the pandemic and everything that's revealed about our healthcare system and healthcare around the globe, this becomes increasingly important to think about. Okay, so clearly these show that the planetary boundaries framework, the data that we are collecting, the observations that we are making around the globe are illustrating this rippling, cascading effect of climate change. So the question then becomes, we know that the combustion of fossil fuels is largely, not entirely, but largely to blame for the set of impacts that we're seeing. Where are we when it comes to the trajectory of those greenhouse gas emissions? And after our break, we'll get to Canada's progress, or lack thereof, not to scoop myself. But I'd just like to pull out some of the most important findings from the sixth assessment report, because it's a mixed bag. It kind of depends on your wiring, whether or not you take the sixth assessment cycle as reason for inspiration or just total devastation. So it depends on how I wake up in the morning. So I'll go through both sides of that coin for you very briefly. Okay, so the devastation side is that the IPCC sixth assessment cycle compellingly, conclusively demonstrates that emissions over the last decade have been the highest in human history. We've been talking about climate change for quite a while now, 30 years. Well, some would say 200, but anyway, 30 years. And yet emissions are the highest in human history over the last 10 years. And so we are not currently on track to limiting warming to 2 degrees or even better, 1.5 degrees above average pre-industrial levels. We are not getting there yet. We're not on track globally. However, hallelujah, there is real evidence accumulated over the last 10 years, sort of period of assessment cycle of the IPCC, for sustained real greenhouse gas reductions in some countries that are not attributed to like global economic calamity or health pandemic stuff. So those do cause dips. You know, you'll see a like 6% dip in GHG emissions in 2021 or whatever, at enormous cost to livelihoods, well-being, et cetera. That's actually not how we want to reduce emissions, by sending everyone home for 2 years. But there is real sustained evidence of greenhouse gas reduction in 18 countries that is on track to reducing emissions at the levels needed to constrain warming to 1.5 degrees. That's kind of exciting. There's 197 countries in the world, but 18, I think 197, give or take 1 or 2, but 18 of them are on track. Before I finish that thought, what that means is there are paths to follow. There are, yes, Japan, UK, Germany, not Canada. The US is. Canada's far from that list. The US is on that list. I don't know what the other 14 or so are, but they have different reasons for being on that track. Some of them, a lot of the major progress has come from moving away from coal, burning coal for electricity. That was a major win in the Canadian context, but our electricity system is largely decarbonized anyway because of hydro and nuclear. So that actually makes electricity not the low-hanging fruit in Canada that it is in other countries. But there are lots of reasons for either an industrial transition, greater efficiency in industry, transportation, important transportation changes, and urban planning changes in some countries, et cetera. Usually some version of a price on carbon, et cetera. So there's some indications of what works. Beyond our wildest dreams, the cost of renewables has plummeted. So up to 85% reduction in the cost of solar, wind, and battery technologies, that kind of crucial thinking technology. So that has been an incredible tool in the process and a really good sign of things to come. And it's part of the reason why, just to pause a moment and think about how we generally perceive the scale of the climate change problem. And I'm sure if you do work, as I assume you do, in the climate space and you're asked to speak about this, or especially speak to younger people, I'm often asked about the sort of despair and climate anxiety, eco-anxiety and stress that people are feeling. And it's occurred to me lately that sometimes we sort of assume, because this is such a messy, nasty problem that's moving so slow, that we kind of visualize the problem like there's this mountain and we're pushing this boulder up and we're at the bottom of the mountain and we're just pushing and pushing, and I don't know, it's just not getting anywhere. But I because of some of these elements of transition, I wonder if actually we're closer to the top of that mountain, and we're just about, or even coming down the other side a little bit, that the energy transition has, I mean, it certainly has already begun, but we're well on our way in some aspects of it to such an extent that we may look back in history and go, actually, you know what, like the seeds were planted in the 90s or the early 2000s, and they were really gaining steam by the 2020s. It's not fast enough, but we may, you know, be sort of building momentum, I think. So another important finding of the IPCC is that we have the solutions in every sector that can already deliver a halving of our emissions, reducing our emissions by 50% by 2030. We've been having this conversation for a while, though. I remember like a 2008 paper or thereabouts, the wedges that talked about all of the existing technologies we already have that would deliver like the vast majority of the emissions reductions we need. So then the problem becomes, why aren't we why aren't we accelerating their uptake? What are the political, social, behavioral barriers, economic barriers to that? Okay. So another really important finding of the 6 assessment cycle can be wildly misinterpreted, which is that lifestyle change. I hate the word lifestyle. I feel like, to me, it's like lattes and yoga. I don't know, but anyway, behavior change, human behavior, can provide up to 70% of emissions reductions. Why is that problematic, and why can it be misinterpreted? Because it sounds like if you and I make individual personal behavior changes, like things we know lead to lower emissions, eating a more plant-based diet, getting out of your car and onto your bike, insulating your home, whatever. If you and I make those decisions independently because we're good people, then this will solve itself. That is not at all what the IPCC is saying. Those are drops in the ocean, unfortunately. I think they make us sleep better at night. This is my own personal philosophy, but they help us feel that we live in line with our values, and that's priceless. But they are insufficient to transform the global economy and society at this pace and scale needed to address climate change, because we are locked into high carbon pathways, right? So our cities are built in honor of the car. Especially in Canada, we have so much space. When there is no transit to get into, when there is no safe cycling infrastructure to use, when there are no electric vehicles within your price range or no charging infrastructure to support them, when building codes are so shoddy that your house is just leaking heat, when nobody knows how to or when to install a heat pump, you don't have a choice. And all of this also rests on the assumption that you can afford any one of those things that I just mentioned. So it is a privilege largely of the rich. So individuals are locked into these high carbon pathways. That does not mean you are without agency, but it does mean that you face incredible challenges. So significant changes across transport industry, buildings, and land use are needed to make it easier for us all to move on to these lower carbon trajectories. In particular, a combination, the IPCC says, of effective policies, improved infrastructure, and technologies enable those behavior changes. So wagging of the finger at individuals has proven to be largely ineffective for a whole bunch of really logical and important reasons if we had thought it through, but still tends to be the preferred kind of mode of interaction on climate change in a lot of fronts. So we need these policies, infrastructure, and technologies to enable behavior change, to accelerate the transition that is already underway, to make use of the technologies that already exist, and to put us onto lower carbon pathways. This might be a lot to process, but the IPCC, I was heartened to hear about the connections between climate and other sustainability priorities, because some of those were encompassed in that planetary boundaries framework. But the IPCC and others are increasingly thinking in terms of development pathways. So what are the conditions that enable a transition onto a climate resilient, low carbon, even perhaps just and inclusive development pathway? And the IPCC finds that inclusive governance, diverse knowledges and values, finance, it finds that we're 300 to 600% under financing the climate transition. So there needs to be a factor of 3 to 6 increase in climate finance. I think that's a topic that's going to come up later to accelerate the transition. All of these things along the left at the top are conditions that might enable a development path shift. And the constraining factors include poverty, inequity, and injustice. There are various economic, institutional, and social barriers, siloed responses. Despite all of, that's the worst way to frame it. There was excellent and still continues to be excellent work being done on planning for adaptation in this country. But there was a strong sense that I got from colleagues that I was working with that greenhouse gas reduction gets all of the oxygen in this country. That's all we talk about is the energy trend. That's not all we talk about, but it's a lot of what we talk about when we talk about climate change is net zero, net zero, net zero. So adaptation needed its day. It needed its own strategy and its own policy. So there was not as much appetite to think about how those two intersected during the adaptation planning process. And that, I think, is a mistake. I think that puts us in a place where we have a flood and we rebuild the buildings really fast. We have an emergency management plan and we have strategies to deal with our critical infrastructure. And what we rebuild is not low carbon. And then those buildings have, you know, a 50-year lifespan or a 30-year lifespan or whatever. And we've locked ourselves into several more decades of high emissions. So that will be maladaptive, right? If we are making these choices without considering rapidly decarbonizing and protecting communities simultaneously. So I show this just to show that it's important to think about how shocks can cause a divergence in the pathway we follow, how pathways can converge over time, and how, as we make these decisions, like how we rebuild our infrastructure and how long it takes to reduce our emissions, we are removing options from ourselves. We are escalating impacts, and therefore we're missing opportunities to benefit from decarbonization. Okay, so this pulls it all together. This is from it sort of pulls it all together. This is like from way back, from the 4th assessment report. I think that was 2007 or so. And even before, to think about how Earth systems and human systems are inextricably linked, that our emission of greenhouse gases leads to increasing concentrations of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, then triggering those sort of first order impacts that I described, sea level rise, extreme events, that then rippling out to create these ecosystem impacts, food security impacts, health impacts, and then all of that affecting our level of socioeconomic development, governance, health, literacy, equity, et cetera. And mitigation, the reducing of greenhouse gases, and adaptation, the protecting of communities from impacts being kind of response options that are embedded in all of that. I want to pause and just say that this is a Western settler colonial view of the connections between nature and humans. This makes an effort to show connections, but doesn't actually illustrate that humans are part of nature. So if we were to broaden our worldviews somewhat and perhaps consider indigenous perspectives or ways of framing the connections between humans and nature, we might think about humans as part of nature. We often hear, I've heard indigenous colleagues and friends refer to more than human nature as when they speak of animals or ecosystems. So considering those connections more deeply, I think, is really important, and even stretching ourselves to consider that nature itself has its own agency and its own inherent right to exist outside of its value to us. And so that pushes us, I think, to maybe consider the repercussions of our actions and how dependent we are and how much a part of nature we are. All of this becomes real in human landscapes. And I'm going to pause in a minute for our discussion. But this is a photograph, could be Waterloo, it's not. This is Kingsway Corridor in Burnaby, BC. I grew up and bred in Manitoba, a city of 50,000 people, and I did my undergraduate in Calgary and lived in Vancouver after that for 10 years. This is a very familiar scene to me, the sort of suburban, low density, car supporting medium-sized to small city in Canada, of which we have hundreds. This is a clear manifestation of lock-in, of carbon lock-in, right? And vulnerability to a large extent. So we have low density, except for that poor sore thumb tower in the back that isn't particularly enticing. We have impermeable surfaces largely, right? These concrete roads, so then water, we have an extreme event or a flood and the water rushes over and floods things instead of soaking in. We have very little in the way of tree canopy or urban nature, biodiversity, this kind of thing. You wouldn't want to ride a bike really here. It wouldn't be particularly safe. You might have large trucks kind of whooshing by you. There's no protected bike lane or anything like that. There's no transit that we can see. But this is very common. This is what we're trying to undo in Canada. And that's why this is taking so long to change. This is a photoshopped version of that same space. Thank goodness for Photoshop. I don't even know if Photoshop still exists, but this is about a year ago. So this is, one vision, one imaginary like version of what this same neighborhood could look like that integrates adaptation and mitigation. And you see people in this space. So we have perhaps those sidewalks look kind of permeable to me. They might, water might sink into those instead of rushing over them. We actually have no cars. We only have active transportation infrastructure and mass transit. We could have local food, smaller stores. We would call this compact, complete communities. I'll not call it a 15-minute city because Google 15-minute city conspiracy theory, and you'll understand why. This has been taken up as there's been a very interesting backlash to the idea of building a city where you can get through active or mass transit to anything you need within 15 minutes. But this is intended to be an example of good planning practice in urban communities. I don't know what's around this neighborhood. Maybe the rest of the, outside of this like little gem of compact complete development, it looks like the photo before. But it shows how we could get renewable energy production, active transport, local food, combining residences and businesses in the same space, all in one area. This is a very urban image as well. And obviously Canada has vast and diverse rural areas, farming communities, et cetera, that we never want to look like this. But it allows us to kind of stretch our imagination a little bit and see how humans come together with nature and physical infrastructure and all the rules that got us here in a more sustainable transition. I'm going to talk in a few minutes about perhaps how to govern a transition from A to B and how we might make decisions better to do that. But I'm going to pause now and ask you to do some discussing on your own for about 10 minutes. So what I would like you to do, I assume there's probably a chance for you to get to know each other later, but we're going to do it now instead. I'm just going to go ahead and do it. So I'd like for you, if possible, please, to break up into little clusters of 4 or 5 people and take a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves, what your sort of area is, what you and then I'd like you to consider if in your own work, in your own discipline or area, do you explicitly consider the connections between human and natural systems? It's okay for you to answer them no. I'm just curious for you to reflect on that. And if so, how do you characterize those connections? And what I mean by that is, how do you think about and reason through the interconnectedness of them, the uncertainty in those connections, the emergence of different patterns of interaction between those components, and how do you kind of characterize them? It could be how you model them, it could be how you visualize them, it could be any of those things. So think it through for yourselves, how you frame or characterize them. And then in the interest of sort of moving towards those questions that you'll be working on all week, what is this kind of way of thinking about connections and interconnectedness, synergies, trade-offs, et cetera? What sort of questions does it trigger you to think about that you find exciting and that you're curious about? Does that make sense? Yeah, okay, great. So we're going to take until 10:02. So that's 10 minutes-ish to have that discussion. Okay. Okay. Thank you. No, I guess, I
I'll let her.
I'll be honest.
Yeah, that's it. Can we close this off? Okay, great.
All right, everyone. Classic terrible pedagogy to give you 5 questions and 10 minutes to answer them. But I'd like to hear from you about how your discussions went. So we have a few minutes to share some of what you discussed. So who'd like to jump in and share with us how or if you consider these connections between human and natural systems and how you frame them? Take a risk.
I asked one of the junior scholars in my group if she could speak up.
Sure, if you are comfortable.
That's
so junior.
So in our group, I think for the question number 3, we find that there are a lot of connection between human and natural systems. So basically, I work with population after disaster. So all the impact of a crisis on mental and human health. And my colleague work on integrative rebuilding that incorporates the need of communities after disaster. So for the question number 4, how we frame that, maybe my colleague can.
Yeah, so in ways that how I characterize this interaction, particularly it's trying to think about how people are affected by disasters, rather than just being an engineer. We tend to think about a lot about the physical infrastructure,
Right. Yeah.
but at the end of the day, our communities, what matters to our communities are whoever is helping plan those buildings.
Yeah.
And try to frame, in my work, I try to frame the impact of disaster, how physical damage will be translated into disruption to livelihoods of individuals.
Right. Interesting. So this brings to mind for me a conversation that we had during the advisory process for the National Adaptation Strategy, which was some folks were kind of characterizing the adaptation debate as like, we know what we need to do. We have the solutions. We just got to, it's all clear. But actually, depending on your entry point to the conversation, you frame the problem really, really differently, right? And so some people might focus on the infrastructure, as you say, and how is our critical infrastructure vulnerable, or how are homes and roads or whatever vulnerable to floods and fires and such. And so then if you frame it that way, the solution to the problem might be changes in building codes or changes in building technologies. But what if the problem is poverty, actually? Or you have a totally different entry point to what makes people vulnerable to those impacts, or in the path of those impacts in the first place, or what affects their ability to recover or whatever. Then your solution in a national adaptation strategy would be targeting the unsheltered population, or would be targeting literacy and education, like very different sets of policy responses depending on how you define the problem, I think. All right, are you about to raise your hand?
I'll just comment on the same point. I think one thing we kind of realized, which we'll explain later in our short talk, is about how you're talking about behavioral change,
Yeah,
and how much culture is part of this whole problem.
sure.
For example, let's blame ourselves. We are the big meat eaters on this side, and we're rich. We can eat meat all the time, which was quite different from even some years ago, even here.
Yeah.
But that culture has actually produced cleaning of forests in Amazon.
Yes.
We don't think that far, and we feel like, well, let them stop burning the forest down, but we'll keep eating our beef.
Yes.
So there's a huge disconnect.
Yes, absolutely. There's a bit of out of sight, out of mind issue there. And I think for a long time, climate change was framed, unfortunately, in 2 ways that I think aren't helpful. One, as an environmental problem, not a human problem, right? Like something, if you cared about nature, if you were like wired to be that person who, really connects with non-human nature, then that's something that would stir you, that, that's something you would care about. And also as something that's unfolding at a distant point, like in the future, it's 2100 or it's 2050 or whatever, and elsewhere, not here now, right? And so all of those enabled us, I think, some of us, not all of us, some of us in Canada in particular, to put this off as somebody else's problem to solve. Yeah, good point. Another group, how did you grapple with these or these connections between human and biophysical systems? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess it was interesting, for us to learn a bit about this one group, really. All from the same.
Are you a cluster?
All from the same group.
Okay, got it.
And so what I thought was very interesting to learn was that, you know, we don't want to necessarily separate human and natural systems in this framing, as you were saying, but if you're realistically modeling some things, then that's the way to frame it. 'Cause
Sure.
some people live kind of in their human world. Specifically for that's modeling social networks.
Okay,
So that's what we're looking at as well.
okay. So are you saying that we have to reduce the problem and simplify it somewhat to be able to break off pieces that we can meaningfully model or process or even have expertise in?
Yeah, and like, if you're just modeling the status quo, how many people live their lives, then it is a split. between
Yeah.
A human world.
Yeah.
Interaction, and we were looking at, some people, are mitigators, are not mitigators, and how they interact, and then how we propagate.
Okay,
Learning. Yeah. So that context makes sense to just look at humans separate from
got it.
that.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
Do we want a discussion now? Or just-
Yeah, please do. Yes, I'd rather it be
So, I guess plan is
natural.
yeah, to have more time later, but maybe, yeah. I think there are ways of approaching modeling that will enable the one, the low hanging fruit in a way, the one that's obvious, suggested aging. There are things that are not even material can be considered as agent. And after agent-based modeling is as good as how well you understand the agents of the interaction. So you put everything that you think is valuable about the very nature of the cases. As if it was on the same level of another kind of agent. And then the model doesn't really know different if it's wrong.
So we have tools.
Maybe.
Maybe. We're working on tools. We're working on tools. We have tools, Don. I was gonna say. Yeah. So this is part of, I think, what we have in front of us for the week is sharing, the tools that we all know well or have contributed to building to think through these connections. I'm going to present one conceptual lens and practical lens in a sec that my community uses a lot to think through these connections as well. But one more group, a couple of thoughts on how you're dealing with the connections between, or how you approach those connections in your own work.
Diverse, with the applied mathematics, engineering, marine science, and watershed science, and we all talk about our interface with human and natural systems, and how decision making is informed by applied mathematics. So it's using a tool to help humans make decisions. The other work was based on infrastructure that supports human communication, so internet technology. And then one interesting point about the marine environment was looking at creatures, mussels perhaps, as selfish agents that are mimicking humans, and how we all sort of are out for ourselves and might be in the transit of the problem. Humans just selfish and trying to be driven towards our own needs. And as opposed to working collectively on these problems. And then from the science perspective, this looking at a natural system and trying to motivate people to protect nature for its own sake. It's very difficult when the people you're trying to get buy-in are motivated by their bottom line. So
Right.
yeah, you have to marry the human and natural system. I think it would make realistic change.
Yeah, great. I love it when we sort of press together completely different disciplinary backgrounds and perspectives and try and find some common ground. It's always fruitful. And I would just say that individualistic kind of orientation is not universal globally, right? The cultures really vary in the extent to which they're collectively oriented or honor individualist achievement, et cetera. And we have historically built mechanisms for collective good. That's what governance, social safety nets, which are relatively new in human history, that is a manifestation of a more collectivist orientation, but we just need to keep in mind that diversity of approaches. We could get into a deep philosophical discussion about whether humans are at their core selfish or not, but perhaps today is not the time. Okay, so thanks everyone for that discussion. I'd like to move into exactly these questions, if I can, about how we work together to make better decisions with collective good in mind. So do we have any political scientists in the room? I suspect there's not a one. Anybody in international relations? Any sociologists? Adjacent, okay.
I'm in political ecology.
Okay, great. You are probably the closest to that area. Okay, so some of this may be, this is very, very like introductory kind of throwing some ideas out at you, but it is sort of the familiar turf of political scientists and sociologists to think about how we work together to solve collective problems. That is kind of the nature. And so political scientists think a lot about power. They think a lot about agency, like, you know, the extent to which you can act and your perceived efficacy, et cetera. So we're coming to, so I'd like to just sort of introduce to you a couple of ideas that I use to grapple with how we bring the human and the natural together to make better decisions. And all of this is in the context of Canada's abject failure. So this graph shows our greenhouse gas emissions trajectory in Canada. That's that orange line at the top, going back to 1990, which was the baseline year for our greenhouse gases, according to the Kyoto Protocol, right? And each line optimistically, like skidding down off of that top orange line, is various greenhouse gas reduction targets that we have proposed since 1990 through federal plans or global agreements like the Kyoto Protocol, Copenhagen Target, Paris Agreement, et cetera. So all this to say that our actual emissions in this country have been stubbornly resilient to our best efforts to set greenhouse gas reduction targets. Our national inventory report was just released a few days ago. You may have seen it, although it didn't really seem to make a splash on the news. But I was very interested to see how it was framed by the Canadian Climate Institute and others. And the top line message that I saw was that correct me if I'm wrong, our emissions have gone down 8.4% since 2005 in Canada. So our emissions, 2005 is a great year to pick. Our emissions went up steadily from 1990 to 2005 and have come down gradually since 2005. That's the sort of general picture of GHG emissions in this country. They've ticked up like 1.5%, I think, from last year. So the top line story could have been our emissions went up since last year, but that's not what I've seen in the headlines. I've seen that better number, which is that they've gone down since 2005. There's a very good reason for a lot of that. our population is growing faster than most other wealthy industrialized countries, largely because of immigration. So our population is going up. That means emissions go up. They just have to. We are also, as you very well know, an oil and gas producing nation. That's baked into our economy, and transitioning away from that is really, really tough. We also have that issue of the low hanging fruit not being there on the electricity side, a largely decarbonized electricity sector. There's not an easy win there. So there are some really good, these are not excuses, these are explanations for why this ship is hard to turn in Canada. And we also vociferously defend our right to extract and sell fossil fuels. That's part of our identity in Canada. It also takes time for the real, actual, tangible policy changes that have been made at the federal level to bear fruit. There's a lag there between the implementation of a carbon tax, raising that carbon tax to a point where it actually changes our behavior, and then seeing emissions go down, et cetera. So this takes some time, but it highlights just how tricky the governance of climate change is. And we often characterize climate change, you may have heard this phrase before or seen this framing, as a super wicked problem. And it is a super wicked problem because one could argue time is running out. I'm not a huge fan, actually, of arguments that like imagine a cliff at some distant point in the future and then we fall off that cliff. Many of us, not all of us, this is tragic, but most of us will be here on the other side of that cliff, still trying to solve this problem after 2030, 2040, 2050. But nonetheless, as time rolls on and emissions go up and temperatures go up, the options that we have are constrained. We are causing the problem and we are trying to solve it. That makes it very intractable. There's a lacking central authority, like especially globally. This is a global challenge, and we try to come to global agreements around how to deal with it, like Paris and Kyoto, et cetera. But despite those who object to the 15-minute city, there is no global overlord. There is a tendency to discount the future. So we have this collective action and governance challenge. In my heart, I see climate change not as a technical challenge, but as a governance one. So what is that? This is like introduction to government. We often kind of say governance, but mean government. And I want to distinguish between the two because it helps us think through the complexity of the issue. So government is this formal body that has the authority to make decisions in whatever political system you're talking about. They usually have the capacity for coercion, like making you do something that you wouldn't otherwise do. Regulation, it's a formal type of authority rather than an informal type of authority. There are sort of top-down lines of command and typically a monopoly on coercive power. So this is government. It's an organization. It's an entity. It is only one actor in the constellation of actors that have to make decisions around how to proceed on climate change. For that, we would be talking about governance. So governance is this way that all of these different groups interact to make decisions about an issue of collective importance. And those actors might be, for instance, not just the federal government, but the provincial, the municipal, regional governments, indigenous national organizations and territories, civil society organizations, private sector actors. These are all entities that work together to come up with solutions, to implement them, to shift culture and behavior, to even set informal and formal rules for behavior. So it's all of that we're trying to navigate, not simply the policy of government. And there are a couple of particularly crucial questions in the study of the governance of climate change, which is this issue best governed globally? Because climate change is a global phenomenon and 1 ton of carbon dioxide emitted anywhere has the same effect, right? It goes up into the atmosphere, it mixes evenly, and it causes the impacts that we're seeing. The impacts aren't distributed equally globally, but emissions, you could reduce them anywhere, and that would technically be beneficial for climate change. The action of a very few like us have incredible impacts on the many, especially the poorest, and coordination might lead to more efficient outcomes. That's why we try to grapple with it globally. So where is it? Let's find where it's cheapest to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because that would be the smartest. Let's find where it's fastest, because that's our goal, is just ratcheting down emissions as fast as possible. However, you may have other goals. We do have other goals, like improving biodiversity, like improving our physical health, like more just and inclusive societies. So then it actually does matter where you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions and how you're reducing them. We could envision, if we like pressed ourselves and imagined something unusual, I guess. I don't know if this is unusual, but I could imagine a low carbon, wildly unequal, unjust society, right? Where you tackled none of your underlying issues related to poverty or equity or gender or biodiversity or anything, any of your other sustainable development goals. But you, I don't know, finally scaled up carbon capture and storage, right? So you're ratcheting down carbon and dealing with exactly nothing else that matters to you as a society. So this then suggests that there are reasons to govern this more locally. And there are good reasons. It gets very complex at the global level. You have countries coming together to try and agree on greenhouse gas reduction targets, but they're also in trade disputes. They're also invading one another. They're also, hashing out human rights conflicts. There's all of these issues get thrust onto the table when we start to talk about global negotiations. And you'll see those play out as the IPCC approves its final summary for policymakers. You will see national negotiators from different countries kind of making the case for other issues. The bigger in scale we get, this uncertainty multiplies on itself. And so we get ever increasing uncertainty and certainly implementation barriers because of no global overlord. We also asked the question of whether or not our focus when it comes to the good governance of climate change is having a good process. So how are we bringing people together to decide what is a desirable future and what steps we're going to take to get there? Are we ensuring that all groups have access to that conversation, or representatives of those groups? Are we ensuring that people feel empowered to speak up, that they have the skills needed to actively engage in these conversations? Do we have an open and free media? Do we have open, fair and free elections? Do we have free competition in the private sector? Do we have transparency of all of this? So is this what we're focusing on? Setting up a good process, which is crucial, especially as development paths change and we're trying to learn, right? Are we on the right path? We need to adapt. We need to make different decisions. Or are we just aiming for outcome? Do we want the most efficient outcome? Do we want the least cost? Is it our goal to just reduce emissions as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible? Process be damned. You will see arguments emerging for either side and often for both at the same time. Okay, so here we are. We have to simultaneously reckon with the urgent climate crisis, with linkages between human and natural systems, and with governance requiring collective action at multiple scales. How can we think through all of that? In the few minutes remaining to me, I'm going to show you one kind of conceptual framework for doing that. And then I might just take a couple of extra minutes if there's any questions. So just to define what I think, one way to think about the scale of change that's needed is to call it a transformation. We hear this word a lot. Sometimes we hear the word transition. In my world, in the field of socio-technical or sustainability transitions, those have very specific meanings that are here. Essentially, both, though, talk about a fundamental shift in the social and technical system, bringing those two together. So a deep shift in that system. A non-linear change in its function, in its identity. This messy diagram here is called the multi-level perspective. It made its way into the IPCC sixth assessment cycle after a decade or two of work by Frank Heels and Jan Rotmans and Dirk Loorbach and Nikki Franciscaki and others in the sustainability transitions field. And essentially this way of thinking about the complexity of sustainability transitions is that in the middle, we don't just have a technology. We have a technology that's embedded in culture, that's locked in, that's like supported by rules, our taxation system, our building codes, whatever, rules of the road. So there's the actual artifact itself, but then there's the rules, there's the culture surrounding it, there's the infrastructure that services it, there's markets that support its import, export, creation, whatever. So all of this forms this like deep logic and structure of, say, internal combustion engine vehicles, right? So the internal combustion engine is the artifact, but our perceptions of status and freedom associated with owning our own vehicle are some of the values that tell us to purchase one of those. Fueling infrastructure, roads, the way we plan our cities, so you have to go really far from your home to your work. All of that also locks in your need for that particular technology. Of course, fuel efficiency standards, gas tax, whatever, all of the market rules as well kind of creates a system that locks that technology in. We have niches that these folks say where radical novelties can develop and challenge the dominance of that incumbent technology. And then we have big, what we call landscape developments, like geopolitical maneuvering, socioeconomic stuff at the top. And so this is kind of how we think about the context within which we're initiating a transition. A very brief example of that, I sort of alluded to here, but you can see if you, there's some really great historical analysis stories about how we moved from horse-drawn carriages to vehicles. It's no coincidence that a car is roughly the width of 2 horse butts. There was, those cars followed on horse-drawn carriages, but it wasn't just the car that was needed. It was all of those other things that I just mentioned that then gained momentum and locked in sort of patterns of development, values, rules, et cetera, road infrastructure, symbolic meaning that made the use of horses plummet and cars take off. Electric vehicles were first, though. I'm sure many of you know this. There were more electric vehicles in the early 1900s than there were gas-powered vehicles, and then that transition shifted. We've been paying for it ever since. So then the challenge becomes, we have this like deep structure. How do we govern a transition towards a more sustainable technology or a more sustainable system? We have multiple actors. We have these complex nonlinear changes. We're not totally sure where we're going. This takes a long time. These big, deep societal shifts are multiple decades in the making. And this we would call transition management. So to sort of finish up my thoughts here, transition management is a kind of, it's about 10 years old, but it's an approach to governing sustainability transitions that encourages us to, as researchers engaged in policy and practice, work to actively create spaces where we can have longer term visions of the future rather than very short term ones, because we need to sort of cast our eyes farther, create teams of multidisciplinary experts that are separate from the constantly shifting pendulum of the political cycle that can create some stability. That's what they call a transition arena. Create relationships between private sector folks, civil society groups, researchers, et cetera, to consider new innovations and how they might play out, do experiments and learn from those experiments, and then continuously monitor and evaluate. And this is one process by which we actually, as researchers, can actively engage in cultivating the innovations, behavioral and social, as well as technical innovations that would help to accelerate progress along a more sustainable development pathway. There's lots more to say here, but I just wanted to sort of flip this up as one potential framing. I want to talk about Danella Meadows, but I'm not going to. I hope you've all read Thinking in Systems by Danella Meadows. Is such a good book, but I won't get into that. So I just want to sort of conclude by pulling together some of the lessons that I at least sort of take to heart and constantly reflect on as we do our work. And that is that sustainability transitions, deep decarbonization, progress on climate change is a political, social, behavioral phenomenon as much as, or even more than it is a technical phenomenon. And we ignore that social and political side at our peril. And I think the cost of that is just moving excruciatingly slowly on this. These are collective processes, so we need to build capacity for this transition in the collective, in our governance system, and in how we work together and form networks. And I would call that a sort of new governance of sustainability. It recognizes that as we talk and envision the future, visions of what that future might be, and ultimately sustainability itself kind of emerges out of that dialogue. We need to consider what potential all of these different actors bring, and as much as humanly possible, consider the synergies and trade-offs between the priorities that matter to us, so that we try and actively, instead of accidentally, seek those synergies. It's not enough to just hope that decarbonizing also brings some biodiversity benefits. You have to actively bake that into your climate change solutions through nature-based solutions or what have you. And ultimately, it's a process of unearthing these sources of inertia, the sources of lock-in, to kind of unshackle, to refer back to that IPCC finding, the potential of the decisions we make to rapidly decarbonize our society and our economy. And without first revealing those sources of inertia, like built infrastructure, like rules, like prices, like values, we're going to move very, very slowly. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, but I'd like to open it up for just a couple of minutes. I know we're out of time, but if there's any questions or comments, I'd love to.
So there's a question from one of the online.
Oh, okay, I'm over here then.
So Madame Burch from the Bank of Canada is asking how Canada's emissions target of 5%.
Yes.
5% reduction compared to 2005 in the emission reduction plan. Do you think we'll meet the targets?
Do I think we'll make the target? That's a great question. Does anyone willingly walk into like trying to tell the future, predict the future? So what I've seen is that we have a reasonable shot actually now of reaching that target. I won't get too political, but we may be up for a major change in the federal tone around climate change policy if the pendulum swings to the right, as it may, towards folks who are actively skeptical about any language around Canadian responsibility on climate change. There's a lot of danger there that we can actually go backwards in some cases. So the governance challenge ends up being trying to make policy that sticks, regardless of a change in political party nationally. So I think we're actually making some progress now. It's been a long time coming, but there are real investments in EVs, in buildings, in nature-based solutions. You know, the carbon price, as contentious as it was, is a really important one of many tools in the quiver. So I don't know if we're going to make 45%, but we are better. We're doing better than we have done historically. Yes.
In terms of kind of global governance and global collective, thinking and coercion towards, activities that would serve the global good. The governance structures that we have are not very effective. The United Nations is arguably the only sort of formal global governance.
That's right.
Structure that we have. And it's kind of in peril.
It sure is. Yeah.
There's much less respect for it, especially given the inability to respond to things like Russia invading Ukraine. This whole pendulum you're talking about, the sort of right-wing views of the United Nations as this global liberalist cabal. And I think its respect as a global leader is declining. So yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts on what either connect and turn around, or is there something that would ultimately replace that as the forum for the global common good discussion?
Yeah, such a good question. So yes, I think peak enthusiasm for and trust in global institutions has been reached. I think you're right. And I think it's important for us to consider the values at the core of particularly right-wing populism in particular, especially far-right isolationist kind of nationalism that you would see in Bolsonaro and Trump and Salvini. Like there's lots of examples around the world of that. The logic behind that spirit is very short-term focused, right? It's focused on localized benefits and global collaboration being something sort of seen with skepticism. It also is reliant on deciding, it's an ever-shifting group, but deciding who are the elites and who the rest of us are. And in the elite pile, it is often media, academics, scientists, intellectuals. And so then there's this like baked in kind of skepticism around anything you hear from those groups. And that cuts at the very foundations of our potential to collaborate on collective action, global collective action challenges that take decades to work on. So it is like a direct conflict, I think, with progress on climate change. What will come next? So the Paris Agreement was structured very differently from the Kyoto Protocol in an effort to bring on all nations of the world, not simply the high emitters, but also economies in transition and lower emitters, and to make the targets that people set self-determined and voluntary, and to use the still very powerful ability of countries to shame each other and to put pressure on each other as the main mechanism for delivering on those emissions reductions. That's actually been quite successful relative to Kyoto. So it feels like Kyoto was more binding and Paris is not. And so why should this work? But it has been successful in ratcheting up ambition in a way that's quite surprising and exciting. Net zero was not a thing like 10, 12 years ago. It wasn't a phrase. It wasn't considered feasible or something that we really talked about until quite recently. And now it's almost universal as net zero by 2050 is where we have to go, and 50% reduction by 2030 is where we have to go. I'm not sure what will replace the UN. I don't know if its time is done yet. I think it's very reliant on the trust in democratic institutions domestically. And so when that trust fractures, as it has in the US and as it is currently here and other places in the world, that directly feeds up, I think, to our trust in collaborative global institutions like the UN. And it may be that sort of club negotiations or smaller group entities will emerge, like more fragmented global governance will emerge after the UN. But I don't know. I wish I could see the future. Last one, maybe.
Well, and I think we will have to.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Unfortunately, we'll have to cut it off here. Because we want to make sure that you have a break before you hear from another engaging speaker at 10:40. So Sarah, once again, I do really want to thank you for this keynote address.